On this episode of WarDocs, Army Chaplain Major Paul Belcher discusses the profound impact of trauma on service members' spirituality and readiness. He shares his journey into becoming a military chaplain, the development of the Traumatic Impact Spiritual Assessment Tool, and the importance of community support in navigating trauma. He highlights the role of medical professionals in addressing trauma and the need for innovative approaches to service member wellness, emphasizing that spirituality can exist beyond organized religion. Paul discusses the importance of resilience, compassion, and recognizing one's unique value in the context of military medicine. And he covers the role of chaplains in providing spiritual support during medical crises and the importance of addressing personal trauma. For further information about Chaplain Belcher and our previous guests, visit our website at wardocspodcast.com. Be sure to follow WarDocs on your preferred podcast platform and subscribe to our WarDocs YouTube channel. I'm your host, Dr. Doug Soderdahl, retired Army urologist, and I'm joined by my co-host, Colonel Dr. Wayne Causey, vascular surgeon.
Welcome to WarDocs, the military medicine podcast. This show brings you a first-hand, behind-the-scenes look into the mission, unique opportunities, and deployed experiences of the entire military healthcare team. From state-of-the-art hospitals in the United States to the most austere environments across the globe, WarDocs has you covered.
Today's episode in WarDocs, we dive into a crucial and often overlooked aspect of service member wellness, how traumatic experiences can affect a service member's spirituality and readiness. We're joined by Chaplain Major Paul Belcher, who developed an innovative assessment tool to address the impact in a practical manner. Paul, welcome to WarDocs.
Hey, thank you, sir.
Hey, Chaplain Belcher, can you start by just sharing a little bit about your background and really what led you into the chaplaincy and how you got involved with the military?
I was studying to be a church planner when 9/11 happened, and my Greek professor was a chaplain in the reserves. And so, having served as a combat medic in the 1990s, I knew that our country was headed to war. And so I talked to my Greek professor, his name is Dr. Brad Phipps, about what it would take for me to become a chaplain. And so he kind of gave me, this is what you need to do. You need to go on to seminary, go to graduate school. You're already in the denomination, so you would work towards being endorsed into the military, and then they would accession you on to active duty. And so that's exactly what I did. I sped up my undergraduate degree, graduated in 3 years, went right to grad school. And for a chaplain, 72 to 90 hours is for your MDiv. And so my MDiv was 90 hours, and with the thesis, it was 94 hours. It took me 4 years. I sessioned onto active duty in 2007. And immediately deployed to Iraq after going to chaplain schoolhouse.
So what first brought about how traumatic experiences impact one's spirituality onto your radar as an important focus? Was there a specific moment or experience during your career that highlighted the gap and how this was addressed?
Having went to the schoolhouse and directly deploying 6 weeks later and ending up in Iraq, I didn't even know the soldiers that I was with. And what the military was currently practicing was 3 hots and a cot with the combat stress clinics. And I was at Balad. And so several times I would take soldiers down to this combat stress clinic, check them in. They would stay there 3 or 4 days. Then they would check back out. We'd put them back in the formation. But yet they were still very much spinning from what was going on. And the people I was deployed with at the time did Thunder Run. And I don't know if you're familiar with Thunder Run, but that was the invasion of Iraq. It was 2nd Brigade of 3rd ID. And, there came an order. There's a book called Thunder Run. And there's an order that comes out, shoot everything again as you pass by. And so soldiers were basically continually shooting everything. And so these soldiers would come talk to me about their first deployment, their second deployment, and then now we're in our third deployment. And they were still struggling with what was going on. And, they always talked about, well, you may have, some PTSD with stuff on the road. Well, it wasn't just PTSD. It was what they had saw that they had not addressed. And yet now they were experiencing the same thing. And so you take them down to the combat stress clinic, they'd put them on some meds, they would continue to function. They still had not addressed any of the trauma that they had saw. And so I saw that as part of the gap. And then speed that up, I got accepted into the CPE program. I was at Madigan.
Define for us real quick the CPE program. Our listeners may
It's
not know.
it's clinical pastoral education. So the military started that in '69. Coming back out of Vietnam, they started connecting with the clinical pastoral education process. And so I got into the this program, and during this time in 2019, you could go on and get your doctorate of ministry, or you could get board certified. And so I went the doctor of ministry route and focused on providing. We had to submit an idea of a project, and so my idea was dealing with trauma because I had experienced trauma in my own personal life as a kid, as a medic, and then through this experience with my first deployment, soldiers having a tremendous amount of trauma that they were carrying. I knew that there had to be a gap of some kind, and I wanted to assess what can we do to address it. Like three hots in a cot really just is not working.
Everybody experiences trauma differently, and it doesn't necessarily lead to a clinical diagnosis.
No.
So you're looking at, how does it impact folks? How is that distinct from developing PTSD, burnout, moral injury? Is it just you're looking at how do folks process this and what kind of things they have to really help them get through it?
The aspect of people being traumatized over and over and over again puts them at a higher level for severe PTSD, as well as having the aspect of moral injury. Basically, the foundation of moral injury is a feeling of being betrayed. So if upper leadership has given you an order to do something, and then later on it comes out that, well, that's really maybe I shouldn't have done it that way, you feel betrayed because of, well, I was told to do it. Being reintroduced to uh, lots of different trauma, when you think about what I talked about earlier with Thunder Run and soldiers being told to shoot something that's already dead again just to ensure that it's dead, that had to be tremendous, right? So as I read that book and as I've talked to these soldiers and I have dealt with this one aspect of this, they had to process, pull the trigger again, even though a minute or two later, someone behind them would shoot and they would be watching other people shoot the same thing. And so it caused them psychological stress, which was the moral injury, which caused them, they wasn't able to address it. It wasn't being addressed. They were just being told, do this, and that was it. You got to separate that, realizing that they're they're causing their own trauma because they're being told to do it. And so now they've betrayed themselves. Now they feel like they're going against a basic foundation of who they are.
Now, our audience is, primarily folks that are in military medicine. And so in your deployment experiences or work in military treatment facilities, have you noticed, how does somebody who is a military medical professional deal with some of the trauma that they see on deployments? Things like, hey, we don't have enough stuff to take care of everybody. I may have to take care of a patient. This is beyond my scope of practice and I'm not prepared. Or, hey, we're now, our team is shooting their team and we're taking care of their team. How does that work?
During both of my deployments, both in Iraq and Afghanistan, I worked very closely with the PAs during my first deployment. And he would constantly call me and ask me to follow up and speak to a soldier that he had seen. Or he may call me down to his office saying, I need you to speak to this soldier now. And then in my second deployment, when we had embedded behavioral health, because that was my first deployment was '07, we didn't have embedded behavioral health at the battalion level. In my second deployment, we had embedded behavioral health at the brigade, kind of overseeing each brigade unit. And so you could work right alongside a behavioral health psychologist, social worker. That's kind of how it worked. But it, I mean, my first deployment, I connected with a psychiatrist, and his resiliency was to play drums. He didn't have access to drums, and he knew the chaplain did. And so he comes to me and said, "Hey, I'm willing to play drums in your worship band for resiliency and meet with your guys and practice just so I could play the drums." And he and I became pretty good friends. And so we would constantly talk about the soldiers that I was putting in the combat stress clinic. And then he would then discharge out, giving giving command, like, this is what you need to watch for with this particular soldier. And so he would follow up with me as well. So I had access to get more information because of that. But at that time, I would I would say that we were not a multidisciplinary team in that regard, because I wasn't in his unit, but we had become friends.
Yeah, let's dive into that just a touch. So, like for example, when I was on my role 2, we had a chaplain, but we only had sort of a combat stress team that would come in every now and then to help the soldiers. At a role 3 on that deployment, I had just exactly what you're talking about. I had a psychiatrist, a chaplain, a chaplain's assistant who was helping take care of all the soldiers, really in the fob and the area, but also they helped advise the units that were more remote, the role 2s that we're talking about. So explain to us a little bit the differences and the jobs that are available within the chaplaincy and their relationship with the mental health, behavioral health providers.
In order to be embedded into like a role 3 or an MTF, a chaplain has to go to clinical pastoral education. Now they have to do board certification or get their DMin. And once you get those, one of those two things, you are granted a skill identifier of a 7 Romeo. And so that skill identifier allows you to be assigned to an MTF or to a hospital, to a deploying unit, field hospital. It also allows you to be put into certain assignments where they were requesting, like CID, military police. Some of those units also request a chaplain that has a 7 Romeo. And the reason they're wanting that particular skill identifier is because we are trained in how to observe and assess a person's spiritual components and then make an assessment or start helping them process what they're dealing with. If I'm not asked 3 or 4 times a week at the hospital, "Chaplain, why did God allow this to happen to me?" then I must not have been out of my office enough. And I'm asked by staff, I'm asked by patients, sometimes I'm asked in the elevator. That skill identifier really allows you to start assessing. When I'm asked that question, it means they're questioning God's governance of reality. Like, why is he allowing this to happen to me? And that then opens up other doors and other for me to understand immediately that something obviously is going on with them in their thinking, and why they may be thinking that God is either punishing them or that God doesn't care. And those are crucial questions for how someone's believing.
So how do you deal with that, given that there's, multiple different faiths within the military and someone's asking, hey, how can God allow this evil? Is God causing it? Whose fault is it? How do you approach that?
When I was looking at doing my research, we were asked to tie a theological foundation to an aspect of what we're studying. And so, in looking at trauma, I tried to find the word trauma in scripture. The word trauma is not found, but the word wound is. And the word wound, when it's defined out of the Hebrew, it literally means humanity's destruction of humanity. And so, how do you then begin to understand when we're wounded, who caused the wound? Did God cause the wound, or is God coming alongside to help you through the wound? Very much like a doctor or a nurse, a physician, they come alongside to fix whatever's going on, to try to address, show care, show concern. And so when someone's spiritually wounded, or when someone's physically wounded, or there's been a societal wound or emotional or psychological wound, and they're questioning God's governance of what's going on, the first thing I can say is, well, I'm thankful that you're thinking about God in this moment because you brought him into the picture. Now I know where you have some understanding that there is a God, or you need some understanding about what's God doing in this process of your wound. And so I start there a lot. I'm glad you brought up God, and and I if you don't mind. And then I would say, can you tell me a little bit about your background, about your upbringing when it comes to your understanding of who God is in your life? Because there's where I need to understand where they're at. I don't need to bring them to where I'm at. I can't jump them that far.
One of the things that we want to ask you about is, and as you've alluded to, traumatic experiences do affect the service member's spirituality. So, just as we've been talking about being wounded, the medical providers are also wounded sometimes in the care of their patients. And so, you realized that there was a need for a new assessment tool like the traumatic impact spiritual assessment tool. Were there limitations in the existing tools like the PCL 5 or moral injury scales that sort of got you thinking about what other areas of spirituality needed to be addressed?
Yeah, so when I looked at those other assessment tools, most of those assessment tools, they already had an inclination that someone had a moral injury because of what they had talked about. So they would have given this assessment and just basically validate their already diagnosis. It was more for a diagnostic. When they looked at PTSD coming back from Vietnam, it was to validate that the person had PTSD, the level of PTSD they had. When it when I looked at doing what I was doing, I wanted to develop something that people would communicate if they've had trauma in these four areas. And if they had that trauma in those four areas, were they still dealing with it? And how severe were they still dealing with it? That allowed me to see that, is trauma still impacting them in their functioning right now? Most of those other assessment tools, they already knew that if they had the moral injury or if they had the PTSD, that it was impacting them. How am I going to tell a commander, hey, this type of traumas cause, like, this person's given up their faith because of this trauma that they've had in their life, especially when we're looking at the soldiers that we're recruiting today that's coming into the military. They a lot come from disadvantaged backgrounds and come from a lifetime of trauma, early childhood trauma, and it hasn't been addressed because they didn't have the ability to address it. And so if you can address this and build some foundation for them to start addressing their trauma, you may be able to start teaching them how to process what they're experiencing, even in a wartime environment, so that now you've you've actually addressed and provided them a way to start taking care of themselves, so that they can maintain combat readiness. They can move forward without much challenge. It might lower down some of the the use of the 3 hots and a cot approach. And so when I first developed it, the assessment tool, it was really just to assess trauma and if people were still dealing with it, and to understand if they had given up their faith because of trauma. And so the first iteration, I was at um, Madigan and got permission to, I was doing my ER rotation and I got permission to hand out this survey of people sitting in the waiting room. And so I thought, well, I don't need to ask everybody. I'll just ask different people from time to time. And I assessed, I thought maybe I needed, anywhere from 10 to 20, because when we're looking at stuff in our aspect of how we do science in the, I guess you'd say, the practical theology side of how we do science from a chaplain's perspective, we don't need a lot of quantifiable type of data. We're often looking for uh, data that's quantitative in that regard. And so I was doing a mixed methods approach using kind of both some survey types questions, scaling questions, and then the people I gave the survey to, if they were willing to talk to me concerning their survey, I followed up with them and we had a conversation about why they answered certain ways on certain questions. And so immediately I found out in that survey of the 16 people I surveyed, those people who had a consistent practice of faith were more capable of navigating trauma in their life. Those people who had given up their faith stated that they could not navigate trauma in their life right now and that they did not have a community of support. Well, that caught me by surprise, because then I realized that, well, if this person can't navigate trauma in their life and they've given up their faith and they have no community of support, then this person's at a higher risk level if I subject them to trauma. If I put them in a very traumatic situation, it's going to cause them more injury and harm. And so I had that thought. And so I built up my database and fleshed out that information. And then I took it to a chaplain that was visiting at our program and I showed it to him. He's like, "Hey, Chaplain Belcher, this is really great. You need to go see behavioral health and you need to speak to someone in behavioral health about this." And so I found the behavioral health department at Madigan and asked to brief the lieutenant colonel there, now a full bird colonel. And he looked at it and he says, "Do you know what you've done?" And I said, "No, no, sir." I said, "I just realized that I was able to prove that there was clear understanding to the importance of consistency of, of foundation to address what's going on in your life. And those people who have given up their faith and now they don't have a consistency." He said, "Yes, but you've actually, you're actually able to communicate this in real time data to a commander. And this is a tool that can be used that would provide great insight for a commander to show the importance of why I need a chaplain to provide certain training." I said, "Exactly. That's what I'm trying to do." He said, "Well, I'm going to call Walter Reed Institute of Research West Division, and I'm going to make an appointment for you to go brief them." And so this was in 2019. About a week later, I went over and briefed Walter Reed Institute West Division. Same thing happened. The guy, there was a major. He's like, "This is tremendous. Like, this would be a great thing for us to partner together and do some research on, because this would help a lot of commanders understand the importance of making sure that their soldiers are ready for combat." And like you said, you're trying to develop a pre-war assessment plan for increasing people's spiritual foundations in order to address trauma. I said, "Yes, exactly." And so they were going to assist me in my project. I got an assignment when I graduated CPE there at Madigan. My assignment was to go to Walter Reed. And so I went to Walter Reed. And on my way to Walter Reed, COVID was going on and they lost funding. And so I ended up having to do the project by myself using my same database that I created in Excel, and I lost access to a captain who had a PhD in statistical analysis. But he gave me some pointers on what I needed to do to kind of, you lost funding, but the way in which you did your first one, a frequency of approach is a way to show and flesh out the data that you're fleshing, and it's still valid. And I said, okay. So I just went with it. Um, and that's how the tool kind of came to be.
So I think it's interesting that you mentioned, spirituality and religion and community. And, I think there's a significant portion of people who would define themselves or describe themselves as being spiritual, but maybe not religious. And when you talk about some of the things that help that resiliency, those spiritual disciplines, the personal ones like prayer, meditation, studying, all of those can be, outside of the, quote unquote religious sector. But when you get into those, communal practices of getting together with a congregation or people who are like-minded, how do you deal with the folks who say, you know what, I'm not into that organized religion. I'm not into a community. How do you deal with that?
So I have found that people that say that I'm spiritual, I'm no longer religious, it's because they may have some challenge with organized religion at the moment. And so I don't dive into the depths with them as to what's going on. And so I will ask them, well, what are you doing to maintain a sense of hope? For example, there are four things inside concrete that are vital: sand, gravel, water, and this one other element. And I'm sure as we drove home today and past all the construction in and around where we live, this one item, you can see it sticking up out of concrete all over the place, and it's rebar. Now, rebarb, the reason it's important to concrete is because when concrete contracts and expands, if it wasn't for the rebarb, that concrete structure would literally fall. It's the rebarb that holds it together. So when I'm dealing with someone that's spiritual, I will ask them and use that analogy and say, what's the rebarb of your life? What's helping you maintain when you contract and expand, when you're facing the difficulties of life? What's holding you together? When I did the survey, those people who were consistent in their foundation and practice a consistency and had access to that, that's what was the rebarb of their life. People who were spiritual, what my survey showed when I fleshed it out, people who had given up their faith but was now just spiritual, at times trauma would cause them not to be able to see what could provide them hope to face this next step. And that's what was vital for helping commanders realize, okay, so if it's not this, then how are we going to train them to start addressing and having a consistent formation or an understanding of who they are, so that when they contract and expand, we can help them through that process. And so I developed 4 modules that I teach. I do a metaphysical approach every Monday morning up on the 6th floor of the hospital, 6T, and it's a 30-minute kind of thing. I never talk about God or anything. I use an analogy of a tree. Uh, I talk about a couple other things, but it's a process for helping people look back and realize I need to start engaging what's going to give me hope. I kind of just say that because some of that's not in my research. It's stuff that I've developed because of the research. I realized that in the environment that we're in, this multi faith environment, I can't go in where I'm at. I have to go in and help turn on this. It's kind of like if you're in the dark and I know where the light switch is and you don't, I can guide you to the light switch, but I can't force you to turn it on. I can point you in the direction, but I can't make you do it. You have to choose to do that. And so I realized that I needed to talk about these things to help people see that this is why I need to address this in my life. Because if I don't address it, it may fester. And as it festers, as I have remote emotional reactions and responses, it's going to come out. So I need to start addressing it so I can protect my inner core of who I am so that I can remain strong. For example, have you ever seen a tree blow over in a storm and you looked at it and the core of the tree is completely rotted out? Do you know what the core of the tree is actually called? A little botany lesson. It's called a heartwood. It's actually a different color. And so if you think about that, it's the core of a tree is is it's the strength of the tree. And so if you look at the lines, it tells you about the age of the tree, but there's actually, if it's a darker, heavier line, it refers to the trauma that the tree's experienced. It may have experienced a drought, an infestation, may have been a forest fire one time in its life and it survived it. And so as you think about that, I use that analogy, and that's what I talk about on the sixth floor, because why is that important? Well, years ago, when they built big wooden ships to travel the world, they would choose the mast of the ship first, and then they would cut down all the trees around it and leave that one tree standing there all by itself to face the storms. So they would know whether or not this tree, one, was a tree that they could use, because if the storm blew it over and they saw that it was hollow, that's not the tree to make the mast. And two, it would also strengthen the tree over time because it would take them years to build this. So this tree would face several storms and it would help to strengthen the tree. Then they would put the heavy sails on it and then it would kind of hold that together. I use that same analogy to say, what's holding the heavy sails of your life? When the storms fill your heavy sails, is your mast strong enough to face those storms? And pointing to that, when we don't take care of the core of who we are, the heartwood, the personhood of who we are begins to die. We lose sight of who we are because we're not maintaining the foundation or the core of our beliefs or the core of what makes us unique.
Now, we're in a sort of I hate to say inner war because I've recently deployed and had some combat injuries come back from the Middle East, even in the last 6 months that I've cared for. But you talked about the rebar, right? The heartwood. So we're trying to strengthen a unit so that as it goes out and does its mission and it has the hard times of the unit, the good times of the unit, it's ready to withstand those trials. As medical individuals, sometimes we're actually our own uh, military unit, for lack of it.
Right.
Like, for instance, when I go, I deploy as an individual under the old Profis system. I might be mapped, but assigned to different location. And so you're advising commanders on how to strengthen their heartwood. Give us some tips on that, on what you tell the commanders before to get ready, how they can strengthen and improve their unit readiness, but also maybe give us some tips on how those of us that are in the medical field who may be individual units, for lack of a better term, can also strengthen our heartwood for our future deployments.
I often say what makes this things difficult for some people is they don't recognize that they are unique, that they have a skill set or they have a value that's kind of specifically them, right? They look past and they always compare themselves to someone else, and as they begin to start that comparison process, that's why I don't want to say something I shouldn't say because this will be on social media, but social media as a whole has caused some of this problems. We saw a tremendous rise when some of these social media giants came out to try to connect the world. And then everybody started comparing their life against someone else's life. They forget to look at themselves and ask themselves, well, why am I here? Everybody's asked that question. Why am I here? And so I believe that we've all been given a unique skill set as to why we're here, why we were born at this time in history. Now, not all of us are going to be famous. Not all of us are going to write a a novel. Not all of us are going to write a great song, or not all of us are going to be a surgeon. Not all of us are going to save life, but we all have a unique skill set in the economy of humanity, right? And so you have a fingerprint, but it's not like mine. Your fingerprint marks just you. And so in my original understanding of this, I came to realize that early on in my life, because of the trauma that I experienced, I lost my father when I was 7 years old. He drowned while we were on vacation at Myrtle Beach. It was an undertow. I almost lost my mother in the same incident. In dealing with that for years, I struggled with, well, why did God allow that to happen? All these tremendous things kind of caused me to have a lot of question. And so at his funeral, nearly 3,500 people came to his funeral. And I use this 6T all the time. I'll ask people, what do y'all think he did? 3,500 people came, and, he was the mayor. We had 20,000 people living in the town. Well, that's a lot of people that came to his funeral. Was he a preacher? I'm like, no, he wasn't a preacher. Mayor, no. Fire chief, they name all these significant jobs. Doctor, lawyer. No, he was a 7-Eleven store clerk. And during the recessions of the 1970s, when store clerks were being robbed, my dad would see these homeless people and people with kids, and they were struggling. And he would go through the store and he would bag up some groceries. And as he would bag up some groceries, he would pay for it on his store credit. And we almost lost our house because he kept spending his own money. My mom would say, we're going to be homeless next. You keep doing this. And my dad would say, well, if you'd have saw those kids, you would have done the same thing. My dad's value of compassion guided his decisions. And so when you think about the core of who you are, it's the value that it's like your imprint. That's what you're stamping up on the community around you. And when people aren't taking care of their values, when their values start to erode, when their values are being impacted because of things that they're not comfortable with, and they're going against who they really are, the heartwood begins to rot. If I can turn that back on, have them re-engage and ask, why am I here? Does how I'm living matter as to why I'm here? And what's my purpose? What's my value to this world? Then I may be able to have them re-engage a sense of, I need to address the wounds in my life so that I can add value to the community around me. And so my dad died when he was 34 years old. I'm 55 right now. I've almost lived longer than he. It's almost been 50 years since he passed. But still to this day, I can remember things and watching him do things, and his value of compassion guide his process. And so that taught me early on, like, okay, well, I warred with a sense of faith. I went through that process. And now on the other side of it, I realize, okay, God had nothing to do with that.
I think the role of the chaplain is, amazing, indispensable in a unit.
We were thinking the same thing, but go ahead.
But the question is when you are really dealing with an individual who has lost that hope and has lost that moral compass and lost the purpose, at what point do you start as a chaplain thinking, is there a medical diagnosis? Does this person have major depression? Is this person suffering from PTSD? And is there some kind of medical intervention, besides your resiliency training and trying to understand it in behavioral therapy? Is there a medical thing that needs to be addressed?
I will say 100% when someone is going through the depths of challenge in their life, both the medical community, the religious community, the chaplain, anybody that can come alongside this person and engage them is crucial to this person getting through this process. Where I would caution is that you can't medicate a trauma so much so that they're going to ever forget it. I've heard a a provider say during a deployment once, I can give you enough medication that you won't care about that. Well, that may be true, but the question is should you do that? Because making them not care goes against the value, the core of who they are, right? We all care. I believe deep down, every last one of us, every person has a sense of care and compassion for their fellow man. I know that to be true because it's wired in our DNA. We have an innate capacity to care. We don't want people to hurt. If someone's hurting, we if they experience that sense of care and people showing them care and helping them through the process along with some medication, then I think that's going to get them through. But we have to be cautious to make sure that all the providers are at that table. The challenge is that not every chaplain can be at that table. Some chaplains have special gifts. Some chaplains have a gift with counseling. Some chaplains have a gift with going out and playing soldier. Some chaplains have a great capacity for preaching. It really is on the chaplain that's with that soldier to kind of be the spiritual component of that for that multidisciplinary team that a medical provider is having to deal with. As I developed that relationship with that psychiatrist during my first deployment, I gained his trust for him to tell me stuff about certain soldiers so that I could watch and observe them. We were deployed, and I knew that he was telling me because he cared. He didn't want anything to happen to that soldier. I felt like I was a part of his team, and he was helping me understand the 900 soldiers that I had, the ones that were the most crucial to watch and make sure that I stayed in close contact with them on a routine basis. And if I started seeing stuff, figure out how to get them back to the combat stress clinic or, hey, how are you doing? Are you following up with your doctor? What's going on? So that really helped. And that process was started, I believe, with the combat stress clinic. I think it's enhanced more now that we've got some embedded behavioral health down at the battalion level. The challenge is with you got HIPAA violations and then you got the chaplain's confidentiality piece. And so those two things challenge both the medical provider and then in the military with the privilege and confidential, they just recently changed it. So if it's criminal activity dealing with a child, I'm allowed to report, but anything else, it's considered confessional. And so I'm not at liberty to discuss anything. And so that brings a lot of, so you have to navigate that as a chaplain. How do I engage this without divulging what this soldier told me? And I see providers all the time have the same double-edged sword issue that they're facing. So I can respect that. I've been paged several times to the ED, and I've had some medical providers say, yeah, we felt like it would be good for you to go in and talk with them. And so I would go in and talk with them, and then I would come out and look at them and say, well, I got a little bit more than what I was expecting. And he's like, oh, really? Well, I can't really say everything, but I'm sure you know too. And they're kind of looking at me like, well, I just wanted to make sure that they had access. So it's kind of like they didn't want to tell me what's going on, but I walk in and I get it, and then I can't come out and share either. So we're kind of looking at each other with like, well, I've got some, and I know you've got some information. How are they doing? I said, well, I think they're doing better now that they've kind of unloaded a little bit. Um, what's your thoughts? So we've had those conversations, and those are interesting conversations. Um, but if my spidey senses are up, I will say, hey, have y'all put in for a site consult? Have you considered that? Well, no, yeah, that's on the table. I said, well, I would highly recommend. And so I've made those comments where I would say to someone, I'd highly recommend that y'all follow through with that.
Yeah, I think what you mentioned is, I think a chaplain and a doctor are similar in very many ways. And one of those ways is that doctors are trained to see and diagnose sickness and then, provide answers of intervention. Now, a minister is able to evangelize and say whatever they want and, say, I see spiritual sickness and this is how you get rid of it. In the military, what kind of pressures do you have that are different from not being in uniform? When you see somebody clearly they have a spiritual need and the answer for them, are you able to share your faith as freely as you want to?
In uniform, I mean, we're the only people referred to by title, never by rank. So, I,
Some people call me doctor.
yeah, they call you doctor, but they don't have to in the military. It's not on your
I'm joking.
uniform. And so
Chaplain, you're correct.
my uniform, now of course you wear a patch on your sleeve and stuff, but I have a cross, right? So it's kind of like I bring it into the room when I walk in uniform. Um, at the hospital, I'm in scrubs a lot, and so on my badge it just says chaplain. And sometimes the patient will say, "Well, what's a chaplain?" And I'll say, "Well, I'm a minister. I'm a military minister." And they'll be like, "Oh, okay. Well, I'm not really a person like that, but all right." And so, well, how did you grow up? So asking those types of questions and getting them to talk a little bit about where they're at in their thinking is no different than a doctor saying, well, can you tell me a little bit about what brought you in today? Or what caused that injury? You're asking a question to try to understand, maybe, are they telling you exactly what's what? I mean, when I worked in EMS many moons ago, um, doctors had a way of figuring out that what patient was saying was not really what happened. As a chaplain, I can tell when someone is being very guarded, like they're not wanting to talk about something. If I'm in the room and there's two people in the room, one's a spouse and the other one's the patient, and someone's not wanting to talk, I can sense that there's reservation of this person talking about something right now. And sometimes I will say, would you like to talk to me privately? And sometimes they, yeah, I would like to talk to you privately. And then I'll ask whomever to step out. And that's when I will get, I'm kind of going through it right now. My spouse isn't someone of, faith, or my spouse doesn't believe, and I grew up this way, and I really need to get back to church, and I'm uncomfortable telling them this. And sometimes that information is vital for, well, how can I help this person now talk to their spouse about why this is important for them? Because again, it's a core element. Like, just like doctors, sometimes we uncover something we didn't mean to uncover when we ask a question. Or I've asked, like, well, how, how's things been in your life? I've asked that question before, and I've gotten, well, early on in my life, things were not good. And now that I'm in the military, things are somewhat okay. But what happened here recently, it caused this right here to bubble up. And now I started drinking again. Oh, so are you telling me that you used to drink a lot? Well, no, I grew up in an environment like that, and now I've turned to drinking. Oh, okay. Well, how often do you drink? Well, I'm drinking about, you know, a bottle of wine a night. Well, that's probably a lot. That's a question of how do you handle that? Do I walk out and tell the provider, hey, you need to refer them to, Sud C? No, I walk out and say, hey, I think y'all need to have a follow up with a site consult, um, and make sure that, you check all the boxes, because I feel like working where I work, I'm to provide at least some referral if there needs to be a referral. I can't say why, but I can at least say, I think it's important enough that y'all check all these boxes.
That makes great sense. Let's actually let me ask you a real world question here. I mean, we're talking like what to do when really faced with patients. So I'll give you just a couple personal examples. As a vascular surgeon, I've been called to the emergency room at Brooke Army Medical Center innumerable times for ruptured aneurysms, trauma patients that are bleeding. The list can go very long on that. Um, and oftentimes I need to go talk to the family. And I will tell you that one of the things that I've always been very impressed with is more times than not, and there's been a chaplain, and we're talking 1 o'clock, 2 o'clock in the morning, a chaplain in the room with the families in the consultation room at BAMC, because someone has called them and said, we have a family whose family member is in a really bad situation and they may not survive, right? A ruptured aneurysm, untreated, for instance, is fatal. And so I'll go in the room, I'll talk to the family, but at the same time, I have to plan what I'm going to do. I've got to look at a CT scan. I've got to review everything. I've got to be very quick with my conversation. But the chaplains oftentimes are there and they help assist in talking with the family. I want to know two things. Number one is when you're called to the emergency room to have conversations with these family members or to consult for people who've undergone traumatic experiences within their family or even themselves, what do you say? What are some tips you might give to those of us who may have to speak with them? And number two, when is it that you think that a chaplain should be engaged in medical care and the spiritual side of the patient and the patient's family's overall care?
So I've been in those conversations at BAMZ, um, numerous times, car accidents, gunshots, um, doctor has to go in, break the news. And I've been upstairs in the ICU where they've done the testing to determine whether or not the patient is brain dead, and then make the call. I've sat in the room for 4 hours with the family while they're doing the testing. Got to know the family. They determined brain death. The whole staff, after they said, time of brain death, such and such, most of the staff walked out except for me and one nurse. Those are difficult moments. And so the staff, the doctors, I've always been impressed. I have come back and I've spoke to some residents before. I've been in the room where like the attending goes in and they're going to have the resident talk with the family. They may be a first year, second year doc, and they're going to have them do the conversation. And sometimes the words and the terms that they choose to use sometimes may be too technical. And sometimes the family doesn't need that. They need you to speak. We've done everything we could. We did every life saving measure. I'm sorry to inform you that your loved one has died, right? Sometimes they'll use some terminology that gets too deep into the medical terminology, and you can see the parents waiting for the doctor to say what's what. And and so most of the time after they give the news, I will wait a minute. There will be the tears and the crying, and I will say, I'm one of the hospital chaplains. I would like to, if I could, spend a minute with you and maybe pray for you and your family as you're experiencing this loss. I'm sorry we're meeting under these conditions. And so then I will have a word of prayer with them. And then a lot of the times I will help assist in taking, because sometimes certain family members want to go see their loved one again. And so in the ER, I will take them back and forth, two at a time, depending on the given case, let them visit with their loved one. If it's a car accident, gunshot, something like that, there's all the stipulations like they can't touch them, still under investigation. And so I'm in the room along with a nurse or another staff member to ensure that people don't do things they're not supposed to. But I will take them in, and typically I'll have prayer with each group that I take into that room. Uh, I think one night I took in, I want to say 10 times. I went into the same room 10 times to take 20 different people over a period of an hour in to visit with a patient that had passed. On both sides of that spectrum, I'm not the one that's breaking the news, but I'm often with the doctor that is breaking the news, or I'm in the room when the news is being broken. We get paged to every trauma there at BAMC, 24/7, 365. There's always a chaplain on staff. After 1600 in the evening, we're the only person in the building. Unlike the rest of the trauma team and the rest of the staff, there's one chaplain after a certain point. And so then I have the whole hospital. I've got every ICU, I've got every floor, and then I have the emergency department. And so we do the honor walks, the walk of life, celebrations before they do transplant, harvesting, that just the gamut. I've experienced it all. And so I can appreciate what the doctors are going through, and how they're having to handle all that. That's kind of like the questions that I've had of how do y'all train your doctors? How do you train your staff to deal with the things that you're going to experience like this over and over and over again when you're dealing with the destructions of humanity, so to speak? How are you helping these young doctors who are training to become a trauma surgeon or a vascular surgeon or someone that's going to be in the midst of this? How are you going to help them maintain who they are so they don't lose sight of their gift that they're being given?
Now, I'm going to let Doug close this out, but I think that I want to highlight one thing that you said, and that is that throughout my near decade of being at BAMC, I have always been extraordinarily positively motivated with how much respect there is for life at that particular hospital. You've mentioned several times in which um, honors are occurred, like when someone's about to donate their organs and they're going to die, right? They're going to donate their organs. We honor their life. When babies unfortunately die after childbirth, we honor those lives. And so I want to just highlight something that you've said that may be a little bit unique from what people who work in civilian hospitals would realize, is that we really do honor the sanctity of the human life and honor it at Brooke Army Medical Center. And my experience has been within my military career that we really do hold that to a very high standard and don't take that much for granted. So I wanted to highlight that, Doug.
Yeah, just as a final thing, we have a lot of folks listening who, are on active duty, and they may be listening and thinking, hey, that tool sounds interesting. Maybe in my own personal life, I haven't dealt adequately with a spiritual trauma, an emotional trauma, physical trauma, societal trauma. What do you recommend for them as a next step? Who do they go to? And let's say they're active duty. Who's the next person? They try and find a chaplain? Do they talk to their chain of command? Do they go to the doctor? How would you deal with somebody who's just listening and going, you know what? I've got trauma and I have not dealt with it adequately enough.
Yeah, I would encourage anybody that if you're going through or you've experienced difficulty and it bubbles up from time to time and you begin to think about some difficult moment, that you do need to reach out and speak to either a behavioral health clinician, a social worker that works in behavioral health, find a chaplain. Start asking yourself the question, why is this coming up right now? Why am I beginning to think about this? How is it helping me or hurting me because this is coming up? What's getting in the way of me addressing it? because typically if you can move in a direction to start addressing the trauma, you can move in a direction to start unpacking what's causing you the issue. And most people tend to suppress it. And they think that I need to be tough and suppress this rather than ask, why am I having a problem with what I've seen, or why am I having a problem? Why am I beginning to think about this again? And that one question, how is this helping me or hurting me? Well, if it's a reminder that you're thankful about good things, then okay. But if it's a reminder that this keeps happening in your life, then maybe you need to ask that next question. What am I going to do to address this? Because if you're not addressing it, that's the problem. I think that's what causes the moral injury to individuals. They don't address the things for themselves. They don't engage their core of who they are and say, I'm not going to allow myself to be dead. I want to remain strong. And they begin to suppress it and put it down, and that causes the problem. So I just encourage anybody, you begin to get upset about certain things. Why am I getting upset? How's this being upset about this helping me or hurting me? Do I need to address something about this? I ask those questions a lot in that framework, the why, how, what, because I feel like that framework causes people to move in a direction rather than circular. It moves them in a process of getting to the heart of what's blocking or causing the problem and to address it. So that's what I would encourage anybody to do.
We've been speaking with Major Paul Belcher on WarDocs. Paul, thanks again for sharing your experiences and for giving us a little bit of a different perspective of military medicine and some insights that we are exposed to but maybe didn't quite understand. And also, thank you for your service to the nation.
Well, thank you, sir. Thank you. I appreciate just the opportunity to engage you guys. I look forward to any time I see you in the hospital. Maybe I can catch you face to face and we'll catch that picture.
That'd be great.
Thank you for listening to WarDocs. We sure hope you enjoyed it. WarDocs is a nonprofit organization supported by donations from listeners like you. Please follow and subscribe to our show on whatever platform you consume your podcasts, and rate and review this episode, and share the show with your contacts on social media. Find out more information about our show, our guests, and how to become a member of Team WarDocs on WarDocsPodcast.com. Thank you for your support. If you like war stories and medical drama, WarDocs has you covered. Spread the word.